All right, today we are pulling back the curtain on the clothes we wear. We're going to get into the hidden story of the global apparel industry, looking way beyond the brand name to see what's really going on with labor conditions in these massive supply chains.
You know, it all starts with something as simple as the t-shirt you might have on right now. Seems pretty straightforward, right? But the journey it took to get to you is way more complex than you'd think. And buried in that complexity is a secret about the people who made it. Okay, so let's dive right in. To really understand the whole picture, we have to trace a garment's journey backwards, from the store shelf all the way back to where it began. At the heart of all this is something called a multi-tiered supply chain. Now, this isn't a straight line from a cotton field to a store. Nope. It's more like a giant, sprawling, global spiderweb of different companies, each one adding a tiny piece to that final product you buy. So let's try and untangle this web just a little bit. Who are all the different players involved here? And, where do things start to get really complicated? So the first layer, the one that's easiest to see, is called Tier 1. These are the factories that a big brand has a direct contract with. They're the ones doing the final assembly, the cutting and sewing that turns a roll of fabric into a pair of jeans. For the brands, this is the part of the chain they can most easily keep an eye on. But hold on, where did they get that fabric in the first place? See, before anything gets sewn, that fabric has to be made, it has to be dyed, and the cotton has to be grown. These are the suppliers beyond Tier 1. They're the suppliers to the suppliers. And this right here, this is where transparency often just completely falls apart. And this isn't just an opinion. The Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, or SASB, puts it pretty bluntly. They say this incredibly complex system of contractors and subcontractors makes it insanely difficult to manage labor issues. The farther you get from the big brand name, the fuzzier the picture gets.
So when you can't see what's happening, you get enormous risks. And not just business risks. We're talking about risks for the millions of people working inside this system. So what is the actual human cost that's hiding in these supply chains?
Well, we're talking about some of the most basic human rights issues you can imagine. Things like, is the factory floor even safe? Are people getting paid a fair wage for their work? And yeah, the really horrifying problems of child labor and forced labor are still very much a part of this picture. And check this out. What's so telling is how specific these risks are. When auditors actually go into these places, what do they find? Under labor conditions is things like people working crazy long hours and flat-out unfair pay. And on the health and safety side, it's unsafe buildings and dangerous chemicals being handled improperly. I mean, these aren't just abstract ideas. This is the daily reality for so many workers. And here's the kicker for the big brands. That human cost, it translates directly into business risk. Worker strikes can shut down an entire production line. One big scandal in the news can make customers walk away overnight. So this isn't just an ethics problem, it's a huge financial problem. Okay, so if the core problem is that nobody can see what's going on, then the solution has to be transparency, right? But how in the world do you measure what's happening so deep inside that tangled web? How do you track the stuff that really matters? This is where groups like SASB come into play. What they do is create standards to help companies report on these kinds of risks, like terrible labor conditions, that could seriously impact their bottom line. It's a way for investors to actually peek behind the curtain and see which companies are taking this stuff seriously and which ones aren't.
So let's get down to it. How do you actually do that? How do you take a massive, complicated issue like worker safety and turn it into a number that an investor or even you can actually understand?
It all starts with a document called the Labor Code of Conduct. The easiest way to think about this is like a rule book. It's the policy a brand hands to all its suppliers, and it spells out the absolute minimum requirements for everything from how many hours people can work to basic fire safety. So, when an auditor goes into a factory, they're checking for violations of that rulebook. If they find a really bad one, that's called a priority nonconformance. But, just finding the problem is only step one. The corrective action, that's the plan to actually fix it. It's the difference between saying, hey, that fire exit is blocked, and actually unblocking it and making sure it stays that way. Okay, let's pull all these threads together. Because these findings from audits, they aren't just lines in a boring report. They have a massive real-world impact on the workers and on the business itself. The first key number to watch is the priority nonconformance rate. You could think of this as the problem discovery rate. It's simple. It tells you how often auditors are finding really serious problems when they do an inspection.
If that rate is high, it's a huge red flag that there are probably some deep, systemic issues in a company's supply chain.
But the second number is arguably even more important: the corrective action rate. This is the problem-solving rate. It measures what percentage of those serious problems are actually getting fixed. A company might find a ton of issues, which is one thing. But if this number is low, it means they're not actually solving them. It really separates the talkers from the doers.
So what happens when a company has a high rate of finding problems and a really low rate of fixing them? What does that story actually mean for their business? The fallout is huge, and it comes from all sides. It can mean production lines grind to a halt because of strikes. It means customers walking away from your brand in disgust. It can lead to governments stepping in with tougher rules. And maybe worst of all, it just destroys your reputation and erodes the trust a company might have spent decades building.
And that really brings us to the core takeaway here. Pushing for transparency deep in these supply chains isn't just some feel-good ethical exercise. For these huge companies and the people who invest in them, it's an absolutely critical tool for spotting very real, very material financial risks before they blow up.
So let's go all the way back to that t-shirt. The next time you see a tag that claims a product was made ethically or sustainably, you can ask a much smarter question. Now that you know just how tangled and complex this whole global system really is, what does that label actually mean? And more importantly, where's the data to back it up?